Thank you for joining us for another in a series of programs on immigration. This series is being brought to you by the American Democracy Project here at IPFW, as well as the Department of History and the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. Tonight we're going to be discussing economics, whether immigration is an economic boom or an economic bust. And joining me this evening is Livschiz from the Department of History. My name is Andy Downs. I'm in the Department of Political Science, and also I am the director of the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics. So, Ann, let's just sort of start with some of the basic arguments about why immigration is a boom or a bust for the economy. Pick your side and go ahead and throw one out there.
I'll go with boom. I think that I guess before we even get to the booms and the busts, the one thing that I want to say is that I think, and hopefully it's something that will come out in the course of our discussion, is the extent to is what an emotional topic it is. You don't usually think necessarily of economic issues as being emotional ones, but when you talk about the relationship between immigration and economy, there's this very interesting thing that happens between perception and reality. To a certain extent, oftentimes the discussion is less about the facts and the data and the statistics and much more about kind of this very visceral response that people have to the topic. And so if I was going to start with the boon, I would say that one of the really important things that happens as a result of immigrants coming in is, of course, that they contribute dramatically to the U.S. workforce. In particular, if we look at immigrants as a group of people who come in, on average. This is a population that comes during their prime working years. These are people that America gets for free. They don't have to pay for their schooling. They don't have to pay for any of those. They don't make an investment. The American government, the American society doesn't make an investment in them. Instead, we get them for free, and they immediately start working for us and paying in Social Security, for example. And so some scholars have suggested that it's thanks to the immigrants that we may even have Social Security in the long run because they're going to be putting so much in before they actually ever start taking anything out.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize Social Security actually has a fund that has money in it that has not been claimed. It was paid in, and it's supposed to be sort of allocated to someone specifically, but people who perhaps are using an inaccurate Social Security number, one that's completely made up, and in some instances we'd be talking about people who are here illegally or undocumented workers, but in other instances it's literally just a mistake in terms of how people filled out a particular government form. But there's also the opposite argument, which is that when immigrants come to the United States, they're coming typically from an environment where the workforce is paid less than the workforce is paid here in the United States. And so when they come in, they actually end up lowering the wages overall, which then affects the other folks tangentially related to that. So for a lot of these booms, you can find people who will make an argument about the bust side of it too. Another common criticism or another common reason people say they are opposed to immigration, and perhaps we should specify for a lot of people what they really mean is illegal immigration, not immigration in general. And we'll try to differentiate between the two as we go through the program today. But for some people, they simply say that these are folks who are taking jobs away from folks who are already here, whether they are naturalized citizen or someone who was born here. And that's another one of the criticisms against arguments against immigration.
But it's very interesting because a lot of people studying this subject suggest that that's not necessarily that's not always the case. And again, that a lot of times the immigrant jobs they're not competing for the same jobs, essentially. That they're coming in and doing the jobs that American citizens and people living in America don't actually want to do, usually precisely because of the low wages. And so as a result, they still end up, they're not necessarily taking jobs away, but rather they're fulfilling an important function in the American economy that otherwise may not actually get filled.
Yeah, and we have some data that we'll show later on that talks about median age of immigrants who are here, whether they are foreign-born and not naturalized or foreign-born and not a United States citizen. We'll also look at median income and the types of jobs people have. What sort of industry are they in? And I think most people recognize that some industries just pay a little bit better than some others. So when you see people really concentrated in one particular industry, you can understand that that's probably not translating into really good wages. Now, there is one, you've sort of hit three of the common reasons why immigration is good, that immigrants are willing to do work that other people are not willing to do, that they are contributing actually to the social services that they may not be able to access themselves through the payment of taxes, Social Security, etc., and that with a growing economy we need people who can produce and consume. And one last usual argument against immigration is that folks are using these services up, whether it's education or health care, and using resources that citizens should be able to use. And on the upside, the next program that we'll be doing is actually going to look at social services and what services are available to immigrants and not available to immigrants. So I think that'll be a nice place for us to talk about that.
Yeah. I'm sorry,
sure.
Can I just add one more? I think one other thing that I would like to add is that when we're looking at the relationship between immigration and economy, I think one of the other things that we want to note is that it's not simply just about jobs and who's taking whose jobs. If we look at the economy overall, the health of the economy, there's another important way in which immigrants contribute to the economy. They're not just workers, they're also consumers. And so in a sense, the communities that they move into, they're not just paying taxes on the amount of money that they earn, but they are also generating business and providing an important service.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are several pieces of legislation that the federal government has enacted over the years regarding immigration, and we're going to talk about some of them, not all of them. People who are interested in reading more of them can go to the United States CIS, USCIS.gov website and find wonderful synopses of all sorts of legislation. We're going to touch on some that I think have an economic tint to them, and we were actually talking beforehand. Anne disagrees a little bit on some of those. She thinks that some of them the economic part is just justification for some other stuff, so we'll talk about that. But on the screen, for those of you at home, on the screen right now, you probably can see a list of some of the pieces of legislation that we'll be talking about. And the first one that I want to mention is the Naturalization Act of 1790. And for a lot of people, they may wonder why that's even in here. And it's a constitutional question. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution basically says Congress is supposed to establish rules for immigration. And so that's what the Naturalization Act of 1790 did. It basically set up the first rules for immigration. And they were pretty simple. Basically, live here for 2 years and you can become a citizen if you want. As we go through these pieces of the good old days, yeah. As we go through some of these pieces of legislation, you'll see that they get more and more complicated, more and more things attached to them as we go along here. But the first one that I'd really like to talk about in more detail is actually the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Okay. Well, and before we can do that, I do want to. And Andy already alluded to one of my arguments, and this is the argument that it's very hard to separate the economic sort of discussion, the economic side of immigration, from various other important aspects of immigration. And I think if we start looking at immigrants in history, and we're working our way towards the Act of 1882, it's very interesting because today we have a tendency to look back in the 19th century and think of immigrants who came during that time as heroes. You know, they came, they worked really, really hard, they made a tremendous contribution to the development and growth of the American economy. They turned wilderness into farmland. I mean, they really are heroes of the 19th century. And at the same time, though, we do have reservations about the immigrants coming in today. So the immigrants of the past years, they were hardworking, they were great, and they contributed. Contemporary immigrants, they're not quite that. And what's really striking when we actually look back in the 19th century is we see that those immigrants that we today view as heroes, and we acknowledge their contributions to the American economy, at the time that they were coming in, they were viewed, far less charitably, let's just say. And we have some images, and those of you at home will be able to see the images that we have from the different time periods, really attacking different waves of immigration as being dangerous, both for being different, but also for stealing American jobs, for being willing to work for less, and so. Before even, I mean, and it's very interesting actually too, because the Act of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, singles out one very specific group of immigrants and targets them as being dangerous enough that they need to be excluded. But what's striking about this act is that even as this act is being passed, and a concern, of course, is that all these Chinese people are coming in and they're so dominant in the economy, particularly, of course, in the West. And you can see in the cartoons that you can see at home, what's striking about these is these anti-Chinese cartoons that were created leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act is the emphasis on both the kind of the racial aspect of the exclusion as well as the economic. There are some that specifically address the fact that the Chinese are working for less, and then it shows, in these cartoons, why can they work for less? Well, because look at how they're living like barbarians. Of course, they're not living like civilized people, so they don't really need as much money to be able to support their families. So that's one side of this discourse. On the other hand, during this time, railroad companies in the West are actually going to Europe and recruiting people, and millions of Europeans are coming in to settle the West. I mean, that's part of how the West was settled. So clearly, I mean, and nobody is too worried that these immigrants from Germany, from Scandinavia, are going to take anybody's jobs away, and they are a very important part of the settlement period. Which is, and this is one of the many reasons why when we look at these acts, it's hard to separate sort of purely the economic from the political, because there's clearly something else going on. Another example, of course, is the anti-Irish sentiment, and it's such a cliche at this point, the "No Irish Need Apply" posters that everybody is familiar with. It's such an amazing cliche, but again, the sense that the Irish are lazy, the Irish are not quite human. But what's striking again about some of these anti-Irish images that you see is the extent to which kind of the inherent racism of them, and some of it seems kind of quaint to us. Who thinks of the Irish as monkeys, right? I mean, it seems kind of strange. But you look at these and in these cartoons and posters, and there it all is. And eventually, of course, the Irish become they're the immigrants par excellence, right there. And I don't know if you want to divulge your.
I am of Irish descent. I am of Irish descent, and when you talk about the politics, you think about the time period, the 1800s, when many Irish were leaving Ireland in part because of potato famine, in part because of other really horrible conditions, and they endured terrible conditions in order to get to the United States. Once they got here, they were actually, in many respects, recruited by the political machinery. Rewarded with patronage jobs, but they were recruited because they were a vote. And you always wanted a vote. You always wanted another vote. So there were people in the machinery, especially in the New York area, who would literally go down to the docks and wait for people to come off. Hey, do you have a job yet? Can I help you out? And then after, of course, they got you the job, then you were on the hook. Then you were supposed to be loyal to them. And so it's very interesting that the economic argument against the Chinese is exactly, in some respects, the opposite of the argument that's being used on the other coast at the time.
And of course, I mean, that's part of what fuels the resentment towards the immigrants, that they are getting these jobs. And so again, sort of when we think about, what impact does this have on the economy, we have to decide, well, what part of the economy are we talking about? The big picture, the kind of the overall picture, or are we talking about individuals within it?
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the details of the Chinese Exclusion Act. For those of you at home who've never heard of this or never seen it before, quite simply, the title alone should be sort of shocking: Chinese Exclusion Act. Very much looking to exclude Chinese. In fact, it suspended immigration of Chinese laborers specifically from the United States for 10 years. It also barred Chinese from being naturalized. So even if you were here legally and had been working and contributing, you were barred from seeking citizenship. However, and I always find this interesting, in a lot of these pieces of legislation, especially ones we'll discuss today, there will be a point where they say, well, we want to exclude a certain group except for. And there's always an except for. And in this case, it was okay for Chinese students, teachers, merchants, and those who were proceeding to the United States from curiosity. They said it's okay for them to come in because that would be interesting, and we want to hear from them. So that's the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the interesting setting in which Anne helped place it. It is very racist in its tone. It has a definite economic overtone to it. Whether you want to say that the economics caused it or the racism caused it, it's a very good argument to have, a good intellectual discussion to have. It was not until 1943 that we finally did away with the act. So it was very, very interesting.
Speaking of politics, right? Because there's a war going on, and China is a great ally in the war against Japan.
Yeah, we have a question from a student here who asked very simply, why did we pass the Chinese Exclusion Act while using them to build our railroad systems? This is a fabulous example of how the issue of immigration has a tendency to create strange bedfellows, in that you have business folks who want inexpensive labor, the least expensive labor the best, because for them they want to be able to get their product out and retain as much of the revenue for profit. And so that's really what it came down to. But eventually you get the pressure from labor organizations, from people who see their, quote, job disappearing. People start believing the propaganda that they see about the Chinese living as barbarians, or in the case of the Irish,
destroying America.
Destroying America.
There's this great one where it shows actually it shows Uncle Sam being eaten from two sides, from one side by the Irish and from the other side by the Chinese, literally. Sorry to the people in the studio audience, but those of you at home will be able to see it. And so, but here again, right? The political becomes so dominant, because I think part of what allowed it to pass was precisely this fear of not even necessarily so much jobs, because I think for people on the East Coast, I think it was a fairly abstract concept, but rather this fear of the yellow peril, the fear that American culture is being destroyed somehow by the presence of these people who are not like us, and so we have to keep them out somehow.
And really driven by a small portion of the United States. Not something that was pervasive across the entire country, but a small portion. And in some instances, when it comes to the passage of legislation and making public policy, we find ourselves in a situation where if it's only affecting a small number of people, it's a little easier to get it done. Because in your district, you don't have to worry about it. You have no Chinese people in your district, so what the heck, you can vote in favor of that and maybe even get somebody to vote your way on another bill that you care about. So that's the conundrum we're in. They wanted cheap labor, but at the same time there was the fear going on. Another piece of legislation that's important to look at would be the Quota Law of 1921. This is another interesting piece of legislation and coming at a very interesting time historically.
And another one where I think the economic issues and the political issues really, really come together. And here we're now jumping ahead to 1921, but before we even do that, we have to acknowledge that by the late 19th and early 20th century, the nature of immigration into the United States changed. So the Irish, it's not so much the Irish anymore, and by now the Irish are pretty okay. They're American enough so as not to worry about them too much. But instead, you now have millions of people coming in from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. They're Catholic, they're Jewish, they're more dark-skinned, they seem more exotic, they seem somehow more foreign. They seem, and I want to emphasize the seem part, they seem less willing to assimilate the political and cultural values that are seen as American. You also have the political factor. Many of the people coming from, particularly Jews coming from Eastern Europe, a lot of them are socialists, a lot of them are Zionists, and so you have this fusion again of people. I mean, they're coming in, they're taking the low-paying jobs primarily in on the East Coast, but at the same time, there's tremendous fear that these people coming in, regardless of the economic contribution that they're making, is destroying America. There's a lot of rhetoric about race suicide during this time. And so again, this fusion of economic concerns, these people are coming in, combined with, especially in the if you look at 1890s, for example, it's a really interesting thing because, for example, the Anti-Catholic American Protective League. I think the title is fairly suggestive, right? That this is really not so much about labor, but rather about something else. But because there is an economic depression in the 1890s, it really fuels the membership in the organization. So there is this kind of fusion of different interests coming together. Eventually, once you have, World War I ends in 1918. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917. So there's this combination of the post-World War, a post-war economic downturn combined with the political concerns and fears that people have during this time, and the immigrants coming from these regions as being potentially politically dangerous. And so the combination of these factors ends up producing the Quota Law of 1921. But what's remarkable about it is that certainly there were a lot of unions who supported it. The American Federation of Labor proposed speaking of strange bedfellows, right, proposed stopping all immigration in the aftermath of World War I to help protect the labor force, but at the same time, there's also this very strong sort of pro-eugenics movement going on as well. And in the end, when the law is passed, and the 1921 quota law that we're talking about basically limited annual immigration from any European country to 3% of the number of its natives who were counted in the 1910 U.S. Census, and that was deemed as not sufficient. And so in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act moved it down to 2%. 2% of the people from the census of 1890, and the quota law didn't apply to people from the Western Hemisphere, which will be important for our later discussions. But when this law was passed, and I want to read you this quote, Albert Johnson, who was a Republican congressman from Washington, whose name is on the bill, when he talked about why this law was passed, there's no mention of economics. What we do here is it is, our capacity to maintain our cherished institutions stands diluted by a stream of alien blood, with all its inherited misconceptions respecting the relationships of the governing power to the governed. The day of unalloyed welcome to all peoples of the days of indiscriminate acceptance of all races has definitely ended. So even though it did have very tangible economic impact, the language in which it's actually discussed for public consumption even is definitely kind of political and racial, rather than this is going to be great for American jobs.
And in some respects, if they had taken just the economic argument, it may have worked out better for them. But the interesting thing about it, well, there are a couple of interesting things about the 21 quota law, I think. First of all, it was the moment where we suddenly said, we're not an open door any longer. Come on in if you want to come in. We decided at that moment we were going to limit the number of people who could come in. And the self-fulfilling prophecy of the 3% limit is, I think, very interesting, because obviously the larger your population is, the larger 3% would be in terms of raw numbers. And so, of course, we're going to just get this self-perpetuating growth of particular groups here in the United States. But once again, there is an exclusion. Certain types of occupations were kept out of it. In this case, actors, artists, lecturers, singers, nurses, ministers, professors, anyone belonging to a recognized learned profession, as well as domestic servants, were excluded from the quota. They were non-quota. So if you were rich and you needed a servant, well, that's okay. You can get somebody in for that. If you have a professor who's particularly smart about something, that's okay. He or she can come in as well. And for some reason, actors, artists, and singers, we've got to have our entertainment, apparently.
Well, and this is the time when so many of the people who eventually become so famous for American cultural contributions, singers, songwriters, and this is roughly the time that they come in. So I guess that's why we have the American culture we have today, is because of that one provision. Within the quota law, but the kind of this combination of the wealthy and the domestics, again, it comes back to this issue of when we talk about the economy and who benefits and who doesn't. Again, we can't. It's probably difficult to talk about the overall benefit or the overall bust for the economy, but rather it's about who within the American economy, the American society, benefits and doesn't. And it seems that it affects different groups in different ways.
Yeah, and this was happening at a time, here in Indiana, for example, the Hispanic population was actively being recruited to work in the steel mills up in the Lake County area, northwest part of Indiana. And this was done in part to break strikes. So in 1919, there was a large steel strike. And the owners of the companies wanted to still continue to produce steel, so what did they do? They went and found some inexpensive labor and brought folks in. Then when they were done with the labor, kind of summarily said, well, make sure you show up to work tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And then when everybody showed up at 8 o'clock, they said, here's a bus, get on it, you're going back home, wherever home was. And they weren't really concerned about where home was. It was simply not going to be in northwestern Indiana any longer. So this is an interesting moment in time from a lot of perspectives. Another piece of legislation that we should probably spend a little time talking about would be 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Interesting for several reasons, but historically speaking, what did we have going on at the time?
Well, this is a very exciting law, because basically it abolished the national origins quotas that were established in 1921 and 1924, and it now set quotas for the overall region. So you had 170,000 immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere. And this is is also very, very significant because it also limits immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time. Interestingly enough, up until 1965, all the different quota laws only applied to people from the Eastern Hemisphere. That means that people from Mexico or Canada or anywhere else in Latin America were able to come into the United States without, there were issues and problems, but there was no federal law that prohibited their or limited their ability to come to the United States. The other, of course, important thing that changes as a result of 1965 law is it changes the composition of immigrants. This is where you start to see a dramatic increase in the number of people coming to the United States from Asia, and also not just from Asia in general, but changes what countries in Asia people are coming to the United States, and changes the composition of Asian American community in the United States as well.
And for a lot of people, if they can remember back, maybe not into the 1960s, but in the 1970s, in certain parts of Indiana, there was a huge influx of Asian immigrants coming in. And so for a lot of people, this is very real. This is not the abstract historical concept of 1882. This is something that they can remember. And the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965 did a couple of interesting things. Again, number one, it actually established two categories of immigrants not subject to numerical categories. One of them, which I think a lot of people would agree to as being sensible, relatives of folks who are already here, recognizing that the family unit is important regardless of where that family came from. So we said that's fine, come on in, we're okay with that. And then also certain special immigrants. There are ministers of religion, certain former employees of U.S. government abroad. So in other words, if you went to work for the government in whatever country it was, the United States government, as they were represented in that country, that was a way for you to get in here. So once again, almost as a reward in some respects, as well as trying to build the family, but we have an economic overtone again, and that is that there was a prerequisite introduced that no visa could be issued unless the Secretary of Labor could verify that immigrant worker, that alien worker, would not replace a worker in the United States or adversely affect the wages of someone, which is very, in some respects, anti-business and different than, I think, some of the other economic angles that appeared in earlier legislation. So, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to your earlier point the group of people exempt from restrictions, the immediate relatives, and you mentioned that it seems that everybody would agree that this is a good thing. Actually, what's interesting about that is that some economists think that that's a really bad idea, because that's how we get unproductive members of society brought into America. And if we really want to connect immigration to economic development, that's what we have to rebalance sort of the percentages, and less family members, because usually if it's family members, it's usually elderly parents, so less of them and more of and more of the just productive, young productive contributing members of society.
People we didn't have to make that investment in, as you pointed out earlier. Now, people who look at demography, people who study the movement of people around, not only locally but nationwide and even internationally, there are some folks who've done some interesting research based on the 2000 census, which of course is very old now, but we'll do it again in 2010. And one researcher in particular developed 6 types of gateway communities, because when you think about it, when an immigrant comes to the United States, they have to get in somehow. And when you say gateway, for a lot of people, they'll think of New York. They might think of San Francisco. But there are these 6 types. They point out that there are former gateways, which would be places that in the early part of the 1900s saw a significant increase in immigrant population, and then it trailed off after that. There are places that are continuous, like in New York or San Francisco, where you just see people coming in all the time. There are places that only saw their boom after World War II, places that are only now beginning to emerge, places that look like they might emerge by the 2010 census. And for those of you at home, you should be able to see a graphic of a description of those types of gateways, but then also a list of cities that are typical within those categories. So, but one of the things that the researchers point out is that without immigration, some of these cities would have had no population growth whatsoever. And we know that in a capitalist system, you have to have available workers. And if your available workers is declining, that's typically a sign of an economy that's in bad shape. And the two are related. You need the workers in order to attract jobs, but you also need the jobs to attract workers. So If you have neither, you're not going to be in a good situation. So for places, the continuous gateway communities, for some of them it's immigration that helped their economy stay where it was. If you look at the places that are considered to be pre-emerging, in other words, they might boom soon, places like Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, these are places that are viewed as growing and up-and-coming communities, in part because of this. But the researchers also point out that you have to be able to deal with the larger social issues that are going to come with bringing in a big new bunch of folks.
And this is that perception in reality, that even if in reality, this is a tremendous economic advantage, if the perception, if people don't see it that way, kind of feel it in their hearts that way, in some ways all the statistics won't really do any good to address the problems that emerge. And in some ways, the example that you provided earlier, sort of Mexican workers being brought in from Mexico. I mean, the recruiters were steel mills sent recruiters to Mexico to bring them, to physically bring them into, to Gary, Indiana. One of the legacies of that, of course, is the kind of the ethnic tension in the region when it came to working class, people in the workforce, because there was this deep resentment that these groups were seen as bad because they contributed to the lowering of wages, but not in the usual way, right? This idea that there's so many of them, but because they prevented, labor unions from being able to get higher wages for the workers.
Yeah, and that tension is still existent today. It's not like it's gone away
right.
Since 1919. It's still a problem in 2008. Well, we've brought up statistics several times, and as we were both doing research for this, we found that it's actually pretty difficult to get good, solid data that everyone's going to agree to. In terms of it being official, this is the definitive source of information on stuff. And although there is reason to disagree on whether some statistics are valid and some are not, there is one source of data that's viewed as about as good as it can get. Flawed as it may be, it's about as good as it can get, and that's the United States Census. And the census does wonderful things. It doesn't just count us every 10 years, but it also does several surveys between those 10-year intervals or during those 10-year intervals, and collects very interesting data that deals not only with how many of us are here, but what do we do for a living, where do we live, how much are we getting paid. And so we have several slides that we'll be showing now that have the census data on it. People who are wanting to look at census data for Indiana, the United States as a whole, I recommend just go to your favorite search engine and type in Fact Finder, F-A-C-T-F-I-N-D-E-R, Fact Finder, and it will take you to the census page. And you can play around with the data yourself. You can see interesting things. One of the first things that we'll point out, actually, is just the percentage of people who are here in the United States and also in Indiana. So the first table you should see have just a couple lines on it. 87.5% of the people living in the United States as of 2006, this is 2006 information, were born here. They were native. For Indiana, it's higher. It's considerably higher, looking at 95, 96%. And if you move over to that foreign-born, that last column, foreign-born, not a citizen, 58% for the United States, 64.8% for the state of Indiana. Indiana, if you look at whether it's Indiana or the United States, you can see that the bulk of the foreign-born are both not citizens. They are not foreign-born naturalized citizens. They are instead foreign-born, not U.S. citizen. Next one that I'd want to point out to you would deal with age. Ann's mentioned this several times now, that we get these people in their prime working condition, their prime working years, so to speak, and we can see that actually is quite true. If you look at the United States, you can see that the median age for foreign-born, not a U.S. citizen, 34.3%. If you look at that same number for the state of Indiana, you can see that it's a little bit different. It's at 31. It's a little bit younger, so more prime working years available, you might say. Right, Ann?
I might.
We have a few other characteristics that really are about someone's ability to contribute to the economy. We are sitting on the IPFW campus. We are both fans of education. At least I think we are. We've turned it into our careers. So when we look at education, we know that there's a relationship between educational attainment and the type of job that someone might be able to find. And when we look at folks in the United States, we see that for the most part, those with lower education we see a really high percentage of foreign-born folks with low education, especially foreign-born, not a citizen. And this gets at a point Ann made earlier, and that's that if somebody was raised in another country, might not have the same educational system available that we have here. When they come here, it's for hope. That's one of the things that we heard in an earlier program, that when people come to the United States as immigrants or refugees, it's because there is hope that there is a better life. They're looking for a job, but you're talking about people who have minimal educational levels. But one of the things that people might find interesting is down at the bottom of that particular table where you see graduate or professional degrees. Native-born folks in the United States, 9.7% have a graduate level degree. If you move over to foreign-born, not a citizen, it's suddenly 9.3%. And what did we see in a lot of those earlier pieces of legislation? We saw this predisposition to liking educated folks, welcoming them in for what they can contribute.
And take a look at the foreign-born naturalized citizen, which is actually the highest percentage for people with graduate and professional degrees.
And that relationship continues down to the state of Indiana, actually. So Indiana, in some respects, is very typical of what you would see at the national level. Indiana is a little bit different in that we have this history of graduating people from high school, but them not going on to college. So the number of high school graduates is a little bit different than you see at the U.S. level. But that relationship of the immigrants really populating the lower educational section and the upper educational section is really quite interesting. The next thing that I want to have everyone take a look at would be employment status. In other words, do you have a job? Are you making a living of some kind? So up on the screen right now, people should be looking at employment status for people 16 years and older. Now, one of the problems with census data is this is pretty dated. As people know, recently, we're shooting this in October of 2008. The economy is not what it was a couple of years ago. This data is from 2006. But if you look at the United States, you can see that we do have a very large percentage of foreign-born, not a citizen, who are working. So this is the perception that immigrants are lazy, they come here and they simply soak up social services, is not borne out by this particular statistic. Now, this statistic does provide evidence, though, that these foreign-born folks are coming and taking jobs away.
But interestingly enough, I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about it later, so I'm going to try to fit it in here. One of the other interesting things to note, and this is October of 2008, is that as the American economy is not doing so well, one of the things that people have noticed is that the number of immigrants has actually decreased. So the levels of immigration historically have fluctuated to a certain extent. Of course, it's affected by the situation around the world, but also by the economic situation in the United States. And so it seems that the informal market mechanisms that connect U.S. demand for labor with foreign supply for labor are actually work pretty effectively and pretty efficiently, and adjust accordingly to the needs. So again, that danger of foreigners coming in and taking American jobs away precisely when Americans need it the most doesn't. Apparently, we can breathe easily and or less
it's the
heavily.
Thing, the market actually works.
Occasionally.
Occasionally, the market works.
The labor market, not yeah.
We do have a question here from a student before we get to more data. And by the way, one of the things we'll be showing next are the industries in which native-born and foreign-born, whether they're naturalized or not a citizen, work. And we'll be looking at that in a second. But one student has asked, are economic reasons used primarily to defend perceived threats to cultural identity?
Can I
think that's all yours, Ann.
I would like to say yes. Very, very much so. And again, when we look at it, doesn't mean that there are some people who genuinely don't feel that the economic reasons are the most important ones. But again, what's striking in the discussion about economic reasons is the way that this discourse is framed, and particularly when we can look historically, we can look contemporary. When people start talking about, invaders and cockroaches and the scourge plaguing neighborhoods, it seems to go far beyond sort of just economic reasons, and it goes into a very kind of dangerous and unpleasant territory. And as a historian, for me, this kind of use of dehumanizing language, it bodes very badly for the future, because historically, when this kind of language is used, things end badly for the people who are dehumanized and described not as people but as cockroaches or other inanimate objects.
Yeah, it's the dehumanizing of the other that really it has to be pointed out here. Even though when we were looking at these pieces of legislation, I immediately, in part because we were going to be talking about economics, I immediately looked at the economic implications of them. But you're very right. You cannot dismiss the dehumanizing element, whether it's through some of the editorial cartoons or different cartoons that have been up, and the terms that have been used. It's a very real situation for people. So let's take a quick look at the industry in which we find people employed. We're going to start out with the United States. I think it's always good to get a picture of the United States as a whole and then to bring it down to the state of Indiana. If we look at the United States as a whole, and the table might be a little overwhelming for people. It's actually so there's so much there. It's on two separate pages. But I want to point out one, I'll start with just one important difference that you might see there. There's a category called educational services and healthcare and social assistance. And if you look at that one, for native-born folks, 21.7% of the native-born folks in the United States are employed in that sector. But foreign-born, naturalized, it's 21.8, so it's very comparable. It's foreign-born, not a U.S. citizen. It drops all the way down to 12.3, and so we have to sort of ask ourselves what might be the reason for that. Part of it obviously has to be the educational component. Folks who are coming here, as we saw earlier, the educational attainment of a number of the folks who are coming here who are immigrants and have not become citizens, educational services is probably not going to be where they're employed. And we do have certain requirements for licensing, et cetera, for health care as well. So it makes sense that that would be a little bit lower there. And then, of course, the question I have is, do we find the same thing in the state of Indiana? I spend an awful lot of time studying the state of Indiana, so I'm always intrigued by it. And I can say that, yes, once again, we find the same thing. And one more interesting thing, and that is if you look at the manufacturing setting, you will see that for the state of Indiana, those employed in manufacturing, for native-born, it's 20.2, but for foreign-born who are not a citizen, it jumps all the way up to 32.3. Now, this should make a lot of sense to people who understand the economy in Indiana. We are a manufacturing state. We're one of very few states left that rely on manufacturing this heavily. So you would expect there to be a large percentage of people there. And keep in mind our heritage in many respects. Those steel employees who went down to Mexico to bring employees up here to try and produce the product at a lower wage and avoid paying union wages in some respects.
Can I point to one more thing on this particular table? I love the category arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodation and food services, because when you look at it, the largest percentage is foreign-born, not U.S. citizens. I thought, oh, all these arts and entertainment people. But then I guess if you group together food services, perhaps it's not that the foreigners are coming in and taking over the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and for some people, that recreational services would be perhaps groundskeeping, depending on how they would categorize themselves when they're filling out their own piece of information.
Very interesting category.
Yeah, it is. It is. Next one I want to bring up quickly would be earnings. There are a couple of different ways to look at earnings. You can look at median earnings, which means that's the value right in the middle of all the earnings laid out. We can also look at ranges of earnings. So the first slide that will come up will be for the United States as a whole, and it will have earnings, different categories of earnings. What you might want to focus on here would be the ends of the spectrum. For the most part, when we look at the dispersion of just about anything over a group, it's a nice bell-shaped curve. Sometimes that curve's a little narrower, sometimes a little taller, sometimes a little fatter, but it's usually a bell-shaped curve. And so the ends are places I find to be intriguing, as well as what that real center point is. And as far as the United States is concerned, about 25% of the native-born folks are making $25,000 or less. That number is a whopping 50% when you're looking at foreign-born who are not a citizen. In other words, these are not people who are working in very high-end, high-wage jobs. Instead, they're working in fairly low-wage jobs. If we jump down to the other end of the spectrum, the 50,000 and above, 35% of the native-born folks, and it's only 18% of the folks who are not citizens but who are foreign-born. Next, you should be seeing a median income slide, which looks at the United States, and it breaks median income down by male and female. Now, for those who follow economics and wage issues, they know that there's a gender gap in wages already. Right now, it's about 77 cents, 76 cents, depending on which measure you use. What you see on the screen works out to about 74 cents on the dollar. So the question then becomes, what's the relationship between native-born and foreign-born, either who are citizens or who are not citizens? And I think really what we're spending a lot of time looking at are those who are not citizens. And you can see that even among males, where the wage gap, theoretically the males should be doing better, we see that they are doing better. But if you compare male foreign-born non-citizens to natives, it's 58 cents on the dollar that they're making, which is, they're not doing so well. If you look at that math. For females, it's 65 cents. So in some respects, female foreign-born non-citizens are doing better than male. They're still making less, but the gap is not as big. If we then move on to the state of Indiana, we see, once again, the same sort of proportions at the ends of the spectrum. And when we look at the earnings, the median earnings, here, the gap between males and females, it's unfortunately 72.3 cents. So females have lost ground in Indiana compared to the country as a whole. But when you look at male to male, native-born to non-U.S. citizens, it's about 58 cents again. If you look at female native-born to female non-U.S. citizens, it actually works out to about 74 cents. So in the state of Indiana, we're actually paying women a little bit better who are immigrants, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at that one. So we see that they're not exactly making a lot of money, and that then raises the question in my mind of poverty. What is the poverty situation for folks? And I think that we are lucky in that Census does gather data on poverty as well, and we can take a look at poverty. For the federal government, they like to look at people they've established a poverty line for the United States, the continental United States, as well as Alaska and Hawaii, a different figure. And then they will oftentimes include some sort of cost of living adjustment if you are in a very expensive city. But they do that by talking about 100% of poverty. In other words, do you make exactly poverty, or do you make more than that? Do you make 200% of poverty? And for those who don't know, poverty is really, it's very poor. I do an exercise in my intro class where I have students yell out what they're paying in rent, what they're paying for their cell phone and communications, gas, etc., and they are always making more than the poverty level. And then they try to think of ways they can, bring it back and actually live at the poverty level, and they get very depressed very quickly. But if we look at those who are living at 200% poverty or less, native-born, it's about 30%, believe it or not, which is that's a significant amount for the United States, but it jumps up to almost 50% for foreign-born who are not U.S. citizens. If we look at the state of Indiana, it's actually a little bit more bleak. It's almost 30% native-born, and it jumps up to almost 56% non-U.S. citizens who are living in poverty, which, of course, is usually not viewed as a good thing. The last stat that I want to bring up would deal with home ownership. I think most people would argue that until the last couple of weeks, that was viewed as a good investment. Now we're starting to question whether it's a good investment or not. So up on the screen, you should be looking at whether units where people are living are owner-occupied versus renter-occupied. For the United States, if you're talking about native-born and foreign-born naturalized citizens, the numbers are very comparable. In other words, foreign-born naturalized folks have bought into the American dream that you should own a home, if for no other reason than the financial advantage of being able to, not pay rent to somebody eventually if you pay it off. But on the non-U.S. citizen column, you see a very large percentage of people, 61, almost 62% of the people living in a rental situation. If we bring up Indiana, you can see that that number is only 58%, 59%. So it's a little bit better in terms of owner occupancy in Indiana than elsewhere. And I think it's important to have some sort of data that we can say, look, here are data that most folks aren't going to argue about too much. We can argue about the interpretation of the data. So does this data, I hate to put you on the spot, Ann, but does this data make you think that there's an economic boom because of immigration, or does it support the bust side of the equation?
Well, since you put me on the spot, I'm going to choose to reframe the question and answer the question that I want to answer. And that is, again, to go back to this issue of, what do we mean when we say economic boost or boon or bust, what exactly do we mean by that? And I think that what's interesting, this data and the research that, other research that's done on the subject, it seems that you can be much more, if you start to break it down by economic groups, you will start to see that different groups of Native Americans, those born in the United States, they're affected by immigration differently, and so. It seems that perhaps the group that is affected most negatively by immigration are going to be natives of the United States with a high school education, and so I think that or less,
high school education,
right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes. So below high school, and so then they're the ones who seem to suffer the most because they're the group that's most likely to be competing. I mean, I mentioned earlier that most of it is complementary, but that's the group that seems to be most affected by the competition from the less educated immigrants coming in for the lowest paying jobs. And in some ways, when we look at this data and we look at this information, perhaps one of the questions that we then want to ask is, well, how do we deal with this? What exactly do we want to do with this information and with this particular data? Is it easier to protect those people in the lowest kind of socioeconomic bracket with high school or less education by keeping immigrants out, or can we perhaps do something to help them get a higher education, which without, obviously we value education, but also education does have, tangible economic benefits as well. And so again, if we have limited resources to allocate to this particular problem, which, we have to be realistic, we do have limited resources to allocate to the problem of immigration, how exactly, what is the most effective way of allocating those resources to bring about positive change? And then how do we define that? Do we define positive economic change as improved standard of living for the most number of people, or do we, going back to the previous question that we had, or is it really more about cultural change, protecting a certain kind of culture? Because if that's the case, then obviously improving the economically raising up people in the lower socioeconomic bracket is less important than keeping certain kinds of people out.
And we see more recent pieces of legislation that attempt to try to do this in some respects. So 1986 would be a very good example of a piece of legislation. Look at the Immigration Reform and Control Act 1986. In that was actually, it provided a great deal of amnesty to people who were here illegally. Some people get very upset when they hear the word amnesty, but when you think about trying to figure out how to round up and deport, today we're talking 12 million plus, possibly 12 million, could be more, could be less. That's a tall order. I mean, that's not something that you can really figure out how to do. So amnesty was the route that was chosen in 1986, and that piece of legislation also created sanctions for employers who hired immigrants and really attempted to hit that side of the equation finally. Additionally, that it did want to make sure that it allowed for the pro-business side of things, because there was a different set of provisions for seasonal agricultural workers. So along with that one, we see more recently 1995, another piece of legislation, that one being the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. The names seem to get longer, too, as we get closer to the present, 1996. This was major for a couple of reasons. First of all, this legislation it increased the number of investigators who could go out to work sites to find out if illegals were being employed or undocumented workers were being employed. It promoted some voluntary programs, or actually established some voluntary programs for confirming employment status and therefore citizenship status. But what some people might find most interesting about this is finally, and what some people would say finally, there was legislation that actually started to limit the type of benefits that people could receive who were here as undocumented or illegal workers. And so it's sort of an interesting moment that it became very clear that you can't come here and just suck down our resources. Certainly if you're here illegally, you definitely can't do it. This was a major reform. And like I said, we'll be doing another program on social services. And when I called one agency to ask if they could come, the person I was talking to said, well, it's pretty easy. They're not eligible. And he said, well, that's really about all I have to say. And I said, well, would you mind coming and saying that on camera? And he said, yeah, sure, we can come and say that on camera.
But I think it's also important to note that even before most of the information that we have about people coming in, even before these laws were passed, very few people actually come to the United States in order to suck down benefits from the American government. And perhaps the one exception being the Great Depression, but arguably people didn't come for that. They were already here, and then the situation kind of necessitated it. Although when that did happen, this is where we see it, and you already alluded to this sort of the Mexicans brought in for the steel mills being shipped back during the Great Depression in the 1930s. You have many regions essentially rounding people up, primarily Mexicans, and putting them on sort of one-way boxcars back home, regardless of their actual legal status. It didn't matter if they were actually born in the United States or they just recently came. They were all simply rounded up in order to take them off, the welfare rolls, prevent them from being a problem for any particular region. And that happened in the West. It also happened in the state of Indiana as well, this kind of rounding, Gary, Indiana primarily. We'll leave ourselves blameless. Literally rounding people up, because it was cheaper to rent out boxcars and send them away than to continue paying them whatever benefits they may have been getting during that time.
I'm sure there are some friends of ours in Gary who are doing a show just like this, and they're talking about the sins of northeastern Indiana. So it's fair. I think it's fair. There was actually a study done recently that showed that in North Carolina, in terms of healthcare expenditures, in terms of government healthcare expenditures, 1 or 2%, fairly small percentage, were actually spent on immigrants, and those were primarily for emergency. And we're not talking, gee, I have a sniffle, but I, was in a car accident type problem, and childbirth. So in some respects, we've really seen a constriction of that. You were telling me earlier about IDs and people being asked to prove some identification, and also telling me a personal story about a trip to Russia you had.
Well, and this again, this goes back to this issue of, if we are really unhappy with the situation, what exactly can we do to fix the situation? How do we ferret out the illegals among us and get them to go back where they were, originally where they came from? And I think what made me start thinking about the subject probably more than I did before was when I was doing my dissertation research in Russia, and I was struck in public transportation where you're walking into the metro, and the police are kind of standing there in the corner, lined up against the wall, and then they literally do this. And when they do this, out of the stream, the massive humanity that's going, down the escalator, all the people in Russia, they're called persons of, Caucasian persons, people from the Caucasus. So people with darker skin, they immediately reach into their wallets, pull out their identification papers, and file towards this group of policemen, while the rest of the people simply continue walking by without actually noticing this happens. And so, an American graduate student, you're so kind of shocked and horrified. You hear about racial profiling, but if you're white, you don't necessarily get to experience that. And so seeing it so close up, and just kind of the acceptance of the people who have to produce their documents, the acceptance of the people who don't have to produce their documents, of the situations going on around them. I mean, it's really, really quite jarring. And I was mistaken for a person a person from the Caucasus, and so I was asked to produce my documents. And it's really a very unpleasant feeling. And granted, you're in a foreign country, and so you think, they probably just want to bribe, and so it's a different kind of unpleasant feeling. But I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like if I was, and actually I am a naturalized citizen, so if I was forced to, at any given moment in time, produce documentation to say I am in fact here, legally, I think that it would be really quite awful. But what's really amazing is that apparently this is happening in the United States, because for some people, they see the opportunity, especially today, the opportunity to perhaps do something about this problem. And there was a recent study done by the Pew Hispanic Center where apparently almost 1 in 10 of Hispanic adults, both immigrant and native-born, report that police or other authorities have stopped them and asked them about their immigration status. So 8% of native-born U.S. citizens of Hispanic descent report that they were asked to prove their legal status. And it goes back to the question of, what kind of a country do we want to live in, right? What does it mean to be an American? What are the rights and freedoms that we really like, and what are we willing to give up in order to deal with these perceived problems?
Well, I want to thank people for tuning in again. Today we were talking about economics and whether immigration has actually been a boon to economics or a boom to it or a bust to it. This is one in a series on immigration. We will be doing very soon one on social services. We've also done one on the ABCs of how to get through the immigration process and several others. This series is being brought to you by the American Democracy Project here on the IPFW campus, the Department of History, as well as the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. And I want to thank you for watching.